In the name of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. This is part 2, which I've titled The Church of England and the Beginnings of British North America. It is no secret, and should be no surprise to those of you who know me, that encumbered with a first name like Kim, one of my earliest read and favorite authors was Rudyard Kipling. I read his book, if only to find out why on earth my parents had given me this name. He is out of fashion for his undeserved reputation as an imperialist. But Kipling was, in fact, a very keen and incisive critic of the prevailing ideology of his age. Kipling's poem, The Lost Legion, celebrates the role played by countless and nameless gentlemen volunteers, those who unofficially paved the way for Britain's remarkable expansion from being a relatively small set of Atlantic islands to being a multicultural empire that occupied at its height nearly 1/5 of the world's surface area. The line that runs repeatedly through my mind from this poem goes, "We preach in advance of the army. We skirmish ahead of the church." These were words of very perceptive truth, at least with reference to the linkage between the Church of England, Anglicanism, and the beginnings of British North America. Part 1, Rupert's Land and the Hudson's Bay Company. First among the examples of the truth embodied in Kipling's observation are the peculiar origins of a Canadian icon with which much of my generation grew up, that being the Hudson's Bay Company. In our home when I was a child, we had the Bible and the Hudson's Bay Catalog. It was particularly well read just prior to Christmas. Early in the 1660s, a pair of French adventurers, brothers-in-law, Pierre Redison and Médard Chouat, better known to us by his title, Monsieur de Groseilliers, and who I remembered as a child as radishes and greasy ears, traveled west on their own initiative beyond Lake Superior to the south end of Hudson's Bay. They did this in search of a rumored source of much better quality furs and found what they were looking for. The authorities in New France were, regrettably for these adventurers and ultimately for the future of New France, not impressed. Alarmed by what they perceived as a dangerous violation of the colony's monopoly on the fur trade, the authorities rejected the proposal for establishing a new trade route and fined the adventurers for unlicensed trading. Undeterred, Radisson and Groseilliers departed from New France, and in 1665 went looking for new backing in the newly restored court of Charles II of England. Now here a brief side trip into the politics of 17th century England is necessary. Charles I, King of England, Scotland, Ireland, and France, Calais along with the Channel Islands was still claimed to be a part of England, despite the fact that they'd lost it to the French during the reign of Mary Tudor. Charles was married to Henrietta Maria, who was the daughter of Henry IV of France, and therefore the sister to Louis XIV. When relations between Charles I and the Puritan-dominated Parliament degenerated to the point of civil war in 1642, Henrietta traveled to her brother's court in search of funding, arms, and ultimately for support of an Irish mercenary army to aid the royalist cause. Indeed, it was to be the terms of the supposed Treaty of The Hague between Charles I and Louis XIV, which brought the king to trial and to the scaffold in 1649. Charles was alleged to have violated the terms of his coronation oath to preserve the Protestant Church of England by agreeing to bring England back into the fold of Catholicism in exchange for an army raised in France and funded by Louis XIV. During the interregnum and the Cromwellian Protectorate, 1649 to 62, the remnants of the English court lived in exile as clients of the French king, and an unusually intimate Anglo-French alliance persisted during this period of the Restoration monarchy, and this lasted until the deposition and defeat of James II in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. It is therefore not at all surprising that Radisson and Groseilliers should have sought alternative backing and authorization from the court of Charles II of England. Now, presented with a potentially lucrative proposal in what was to become known as Rupert's Land, the British Crown licensed the adventurers, supported by a consortium of wealthy courtiers, to act under the direction of, in quotes, the governor and company of the adventurers, trading into Hudson's Bay, to trade in all the lands draining into that body of water. Now, the reason it was called Rupert's Land was that the first of the backers was Charles I's nephew, Rupert of the Rhine. Prince Rupert, as his biographer rather famously recorded, was incredibly wealthy and incredibly dense. He was known to be a sovereign and brave cavalry commander, if only you could first point him in the general direction of the enemy. Now, while there was no specific requirement of any policy to establish a presence of the Church of England in Rupert's Land, there was mention in the Charter of an obligation to provide, in commas, public prayers and scripture readings for the men posted on the bay on Sundays, and instruction from the Book of Homilies. Now, a little footnote here, the Book of Homilies, which I don't think is now part of our prayer book, but was part of the Old English prayer book, was a set of 2 books of canned sermons. One of them supposedly written by Cranmer, and the other written by Bishop John Jewell. They were intended as a stopgap, because most clergy in that period were not university trained and therefore not licensed to preach. So on Sundays, if you were one of those, you were expected to read one of the homilies. They're a marvelous dip into the anxiety of the Reformation Church as they deal mainly with women and drink and insurrection. While there is not a lot of evidence of the company's provision of chaplains to its trading posts until sometime in the 18th century, there is evidence of education and religious instruction being provided for the children of mixed race marriages of its factors and other employees, which does suggest that some sort of, which does suggest that some sort of chaplaincy was indeed a part of the company's establishment in this new venture. And so it was that the earliest introduction of what might be called Anglicanism to the continental part of what was to become Canada was not in eastern Canada, but to the outposts in what would be eventually become known as west of the Lakehead, the province of Manitoba. Notably also, there is an inherent confusion arising from the assumption that trade and exploration carried with it an evangelical obligation of secular and religious roles, as Kipling was to point out some 2 centuries after the fact. Traders and explorers of the Hudson's Bay Company did indeed preach in the advance of the army and skirmish ahead of the church. Now, back in what was to become Nova Scotia, other things were unfolding. Anglo-French relations deteriorated after the deposition of the last of the Stuart monarchs, with the defeat of James II at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. These conflicts inevitably spilled over into the New World, where the Treaty of Utrecht, which ended the War of the Spanish Succession in 1713, and with it the official French support of the Jacobite, in brackets, Stuart claims to the British Crown, ceded the territory of Acadia from French to British control. Britain's treatments of the Acadians cannot be understood without reference to the unique manner in which religion had become politicized, beginning with the later years of Elizabeth I. Religion and politics had always been closely associated in much of Reformation era Europe. Spain and Portugal and the Italian principalities had, in varying degrees of intensity, a monochromatic Catholicism policed by the Holy Office of the Inquisition. France, as we learned last time, had a regional modus vivendi based upon the Treaty of Nantes, and a similar regional arrangement existed in the Low Countries, where Holland was Protestant and Flanders was Catholic. In the Germanies, Germany was, of course, not a country at this time, but a great number of principalities and kingdoms. The kingdom of Poland, Lithuania, and remarkably the eastern provinces of the Habsburg Empire, in those parts there was a tacit agreement that, in inverted commas, we shall not shed blood over matters of religion. And this extended remarkably to Jews, Muslims, and the Orthodox. England, beginning with the dynastic paranoia of the Tudors, proceeded in quite a different direction, heavily influenced by the fact that he was, for all purposes, the prisoner of the Spanish Holy Roman Emperor. Pope Pius V issued a bull of excommunication against Elizabeth in 1570. Affiliation to the old religion had become a political issue during the reign of Henry VIII, but in reaction to severities of policy pursued first by Edward VI's Regency Council and then by Mary Tudor, Elizabeth had, by the early years of her reign, attempted to follow a policy of live and let live as applied to religious differences. She famously is recorded as having said, "We shall not build windows into men's souls," making that vital distinction between what a person believed and what they actually did as a consequence of what they believed. Now, all of this changed in 1570. Pius V's writ of excommunication carried with it a promise of automatic absolution for anyone assassinating the king, the queen. In effect, it transformed all English Catholics into enemies of the state as a function of guilt by association. A succession of plots, most notably the Babington plot and the Gunpowder plot, cemented an association of recusant Catholicism with political subversion in both the popular and the official mindsets of the nation. It would not be until 1829 that Roman Catholics would be granted full political and civil rights as British subjects. And now, when Britain took possession of what is, apart from the island of Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, the newly acquired territory came with a long settled Francophone Catholic population, much intermarried with the Mi'kmaq First Nation. The British, in the hope of a peaceful assimilation, allowed the Acadians freedom to practice their religion, but put them under considerable pressure to swear allegiance to the British Crown. The Acadians, understandably, I think, resisted the oath, probably out of a reluctance at being compromised in a political situation that, from their perspective, was anything but stable. And the Micmac continued to honor their allegiance to France and continued a low-level guerrilla war against the British occupation. The British presence in the territory at this time was limited to a very small number of troops garrisoned at Halifax, and they were served by an army chaplain. War between France and England broke out again in 1744 in response to a campaign of privateering supported out of the French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. An army consisting of 4,300 volunteers from New England laid siege to the fortress in what Norman Knowles describes as the spirit of a new religious crusade. After the cessation of hostilities in 1748, the British embarked on a policy aimed at introducing loyal citizens into the territory. A group of 3,700 British colonies arrived at Halifax in 1749, and within a year, construction had begun of the building of what is now St. Paul's in Halifax. At about the same time, a group of 2,500 European Protestants, German Lutherans, and French Huguenots were sponsored and settled in what is now Lunenburg. These folks resisted assimilation into the Anglican Church and eventually called in Lutheran clergy to serve their pastoral and liturgical needs. Lutheran congregations were established in Lunenburg and Halifax. In 1755, with the prospect of further armed conflict with the French on the horizon, the British decided to deport the Acadians from Nova Scotia. New England, after the expulsion, an appeal went out for further loyal settlers from New England and was answered by a further 8,000 settlers, most of them what were called Old Light Congregationalists, descendants of the original Puritan settlers of New England, who, to say the least, were not kindly disposed to being part of the Church of England. Now here again, as we saw earlier in Newfoundland, the ecclesiastical composition of Nova Scotia was, from its very beginning, something of a Canadian mosaic. Catholicism, despite the Acadian expulsion, remained solidly on the landscape among the Micmac and a few Acadian settlers who had in the end taken the step of swearing allegiance to the crown. Their numbers would, in short, be increased by Catholic migrants from Ireland and the Scottish Highlands. Lutheran congregations flourished in the predominantly German-speaking settlements in Lunenburg and on Mahone Bay. Congregationalism dominated the region drained by the Bay of Fundy. The Church of England, while formally granted established church status, and with that the right to expect to receive tithes from the population in 1759 was in fact required to function more as a first among equals in a diverse ecclesial landscape. Dissenters and Lutherans were excused by terms of the Act of 1759 from having to pay tithes for the support of the CofE. Catholicism, whilst nominally repressed, Roman Catholic clergy were officially banned under the terms of the Act, simply reverted to operating underground and continued to flourish, particularly in Cape Breton and among the First Nations communities. This notwithstanding, a vital Anglican presence was established in Nova Scotia, served by clergy sponsored by the newly formed Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, which we will, in subsequent references, shorten to SPG, who were based in the Diocese of London. Part 3. The Conquest of New France and the Settlement of Upper Canada. The colony of New France effectively fell to the British with General Wolfe's victory on the Plains of Abraham in 1759. Formally ceded to the British when having failed in the attempt to retake the city of Quebec, when General Vaudreuil surrendered the colony on the 8th of September 1760. Under the terms of the surrender, Catholics were permitted to practice their religion, but members of the male religious orders, notably the Jesuits, the Sulpicians, and the Recollets, were suppressed and forbidden to accept new postulants. The new governor of Quebec, General James Murray, was charged specifically with preventing the reestablishment of, in inverted commas, the Popish hierarchy, and with the establishing of the presence of the Church of England in both principle and practice. To this end, he was charged to encourage the French population to embrace the Protestant religion and to raise their children in it. Good luck. The governor was assisted in this endeavor initially by military chaplains in Quebec and Montreal, and then by a number of French Protestant clergy recruited and sponsored by the SPG. The proselytizing efforts of both sets of clergy were dismal failures. Catholicism, bone deep in the Quebecois population, proved remarkably resistant. After a few years of failed efforts, and out of concern regarding the political reliability of the new colony's population, Murray sought approval for the reinstatement of a Catholic bishop to administer the spiritual life of the colony. The previous bishop had died in 1760 and no replacement had been permitted. Murray sought for and was granted authority to allow the selection of, again in inverted commas, a superintendent of the Roman religion in Quebec, after what amounted to a one-sided tug of war with the dean and chapter of the cathedral in Quebec, who favored Etienne Montgolfier, the superior of the Sulpicians. It was agreed that the post should be given to the vicar general of the Catholic Diocese of Quebec, Jean-Olivier Briand. Now here the debate, the point under disagreement may well have been procedural. The difficulty between General Murray and the dean and chapter in Quebec is indicative of the fact that Britain and the other parts of the Catholic world had two very different ways of electing bishops. In Britain it was by royal consent, and in the rest of the world it was by an electoral process not unlike that which we know today. In Britain, the dean and chapter still receive a document called a congé d'élire, which begins with the words, "Dearly beloved, you have our permission to elect," and then there is one name only. And it's likely that the struggle over the bishopric of Catholic Quebec had something to do with that misunderstanding. The terms of the Treaty of Paris, which formally ceded New France to the British in 1763, allowed Roman Catholics in Quebec freedom to practice their religion so far as the laws of Britain permit. At the time, Catholics and dissenters in Britain were prevented from holding political office, from voting, practicing law, or sitting as members of a jury. Recognizing the inherent injustice and impracticality of this requirement in a colony that was better than 90% Catholic and therefore effectively disenfranchised, Governor Murray waived these restrictions, permitting Catholics to practice law and serve as jurors. This policy was continued by his successor, Sir George Carleton, under whose watch the Quebec Act of 1774 officially recognized the Roman Catholic Church in Quebec, allowing it to collect tithes and exempting the Catholic Québécois from the Test Act, effectively allowing them to hold public office without the requirement of receiving the sacrament as administered by the Church of England. Now, the Quebec Act was at least in part inspired by concern to ensure the loyalty of the northern colony in the light of what was brewing in the 13 colonies to the south. In point of fact, its generosity vis-a-vis Roman Catholics was perhaps as much an issue in inciting rebellion among the Protestant New Englanders as was British taxation without representation. In 1775, the Second Continental Congress of the American colonies authorized the raising of an army to defend American liberty. This army then went to invade Quebec and took the town of Montreal in the hope that a supposedly disaffected population would rise up to join them. Bishop Briand encouraged the Catholic population to join the British in repelling the invasion. Despite Briand's best efforts, the Québécois remained neutral, but when the American invaders failed to take the city of Quebec, the invasion collapsed upon itself, and the American army retreated from whence it came. Interesting footnote here. The line in our national anthem, "We stand on guard for thee," when it was written, referred to a bellicose neighbor south of the line, who had, by the time it was written, invaded us twice and threatened to do so once again during the Civil War that it had in the 1860s. Interesting times. Here again, in the newly acquired colony, we can see the confusion of motivation and purpose as governors like Murray and Carleton skirmished ahead of the church, while clergy like Briand preached in advance of the army. Part 4. The American Rebellion, the creation of the Episcopal Church, the arrival of the Loyalists, and the creation of the Diocese of Nova Scotia and Quebec. The success of the American Rebellion of 1776 had significant consequences for more than the inhabitants of the 13 colonies. In effect, it created the first officially independent province of what would become in the late 19th century the Anglican Communion. In the post-revolutionary period, association with anything British was deeply unpopular, and that prompted the Anglican Church in the colonies to a significant moment of redefinition. For some, the solution would involve relocation, as almost 15% of their population, about 80,000 people, migrated to parts of what is now Canada. But for those who remained, the question of continued faithfulness within an Anglican context was a matter of some complexity, the nub of which hinged upon the election and consecration of bishops to serve in the new nation. All bishops consecrated in the CofE were, as they had been since the Act of Uniformity of 1662, required to take an oath of loyalty to the British Crown. In 1783, the clergy of Connecticut met to elect Samuel Seabury as their bishop. But by whom was he to be consecrated? There were no other bishops in the 13 colonies, and tradition required the participation of 3 bishops in the act of consecration. The solution was found with the non-juring bishops of the Episcopal Church of Scotland, who consented to consecrate Seabury in Aberdeen in 1784. In 1786, the passage of the Consecration of Bishops Abroad Act by the British Parliament removed the requirement of the oath of loyalty, and the Archbishops of Canterbury and York, together with the Bishop of Bath and Wells, participated in the consecration of William White and Samuel Provost to be bishops in Pennsylvania and New York. But the die was cast. In the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States would, as it still does to this day, trace its connection to the rest of worldwide Anglicanism through the Episcopal Church of Scotland and not through the Church of England. For the Protestant churches in Nova Scotia and Quebec, the arrival of Loyalist refugees in the late 18th century had, to say the least, significant and tumultuous effect. Not all the migrants, not even a majority of them, were Anglican, nor were all of them white. In Nova Scotia, an estimated 35,000 persons arrived, amongst whom were Calvinists, Lutherans, Mennonites, Baptists, Quakers, and Catholics. Most visible among the new arrivals were 3,000 black loyalists, most of them Methodists and Baptists, who settled in the community of Birchtown on the south shore of the colony. In what was then Quebec, the arriving Loyalist settlers included 2,000 members of the Iroquois First Nation, under the leadership of Joseph Brant and his sister Mary. Both of them were committed Anglicans whose education had been in schools founded by the SPG in revolutionary America. Brant, who encouraged his people to take up farming in the Grand River area and to embrace Anglican Christianity, was nevertheless a significant voice for critical change in the colony, confronting the established inequity of colonial society. He said, "Cease then to call yourselves Christians, lest you publish to the world your hypocrisy. Cease too to call other nations savage, for when you are tenfold more the children of cruelty than they." You have a voice coming from the Aboriginal population, even then, that was trying to bring the authorities to some sort of better relationship. In a push to more firmly establish the presence of the Church of England as an instrument of political and socio-cultural stability in the remaining North American colonies, steps were taken to reinforce ecclesiastical governance. In 1787, Charles Inglis, who had been rector of Trinity Church, New York, was appointed and consecrated the Bishop of Nova Scotia, with jurisdictional authority over all of British North America. That's an amazing diocese. In 1791, the British Parliament passed the Constitution Act, which divided the colony of Quebec into Upper and Lower Canada, and which would in time become the provinces of Ontario and Quebec. The Constitution Act directed the governing authority to set aside up to 1/7 of all Crown lands for the support and maintenance of a Protestant clergy, and to take steps that every township was endowed with the provision for one or more parsonage or rectory, according to the establishment of the Church of England. Again, good luck. In 1793, due in large part to the advocacy of John Graves Simcoe, the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada, two significant acts of Parliament added further structure to the authority of the Anglican establishment in the new colony. The Marriage Act officially reserved the right to solemnizing of all marriages in Upper and Lower Canada to the clergy of the Church of England. The same year saw the creation of the Anglican Diocese of Quebec, with the appointment and consecration of Jacob Mountain as the first bishop of this diocese. Now, particular notice should be given to the proprietary tone and intention of these actions, notwithstanding the presence of a great many other vigorous denominational manifestations of the Christian faith in these colonies. It was presumed that the status quo in terms of the Church of England's existence as the, in inverted commas, established church, in the same manner that it enjoyed in England, would be transplanted into the new colonies. One can only wonder at what must have been going through the minds of folks like Inglis, Mountain, and Simcoe as they were confronted with the challenges of establishing a viable ministry and its parochial support system in a vast and largely not just unsettled, but largely undiscovered country. One wonders what they must have thought, or indeed if they, being to some extent people of their time and not of ours, even had thoughts about the questionable nature of the proprietary mandate with which they had been charged from authorities half a world away. We preach in advance of the army and skirmish ahead of the church. Never was there a period so aptly described by Kipling's verse as was that of the conquest and acquisition of British North America, and the subsequent effort to establish therein an Anglican presence as a bulwark against French Catholicism and American dissent. The story of how this initiative succeeded, but in a way not expected by its imperialist initiators, will comprise the substance of the third section of this set of lectures. Amen.